Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome everyone to this podcast. He was a transformative Australian educator whose influence on curriculum and pedagogy remains strong. Born in Mount Barker, South Australia, he excelled academically and athletically, earning a BA Honours from University of Adelaide and a Diploma of Teaching. He began his career teaching English, Latin and mathematics in secondary schools before becoming South Australia's first English consultant. His scholarship at the University of London, Master of Education 1973, marked a turning point, fueling his passion for language and learning. Upon returning, he took on roles such as Education Officer, School Inspector and Director of Wattle Park Teacher Centre, where he impacted curriculum and teacher development. His influence extended nationally and internationally. By 1984, he was Director of the National Curriculum Development Centre in Canberra, and later chaired the Commonwealth Schools Commission. Returning to South Australia in 1988, he served as Associate Director-General of Education Curriculum. His contributions to the Australian Association for the Teaching of English, AATE, and the International Federation for the Teaching of English were notable. He advocated for a pragmatic, radical approach, balancing fiscal realities with social justice and educational reform. He emphasised collaborative learning and democratic classrooms, viewing teachers as intellectuals who continually refine their practice. His legacy includes seminal works like The Spitting Image and Negotiating the Curriculum. A lifelong member of AATE, he was celebrated for his dynamic oratory and writing. His death from brain cancer in 1993 was a significant loss, but his ideas continue to inspire educators. The University of South Australia's Education Faculty Building is named in his honour, ensuring his enduring impact on Australian education. And Sharon, I'm talking, of course, about the amazing Garth Boomer, the education great we are highlighting in this podcast. Many young teachers probably have not heard of him, but in South Australia, they may have studied in the University of South Australia building bearing his name. One of the schools you work at, Littlehampton Primary School, has their library named after him, and they have a whole proud history of him there. And I think he also attended school there?
He certainly did. So it's a primary school, and he attended, I believe, for all of his primary years there. And it's their resource centre, which is this magnificent space at Littlehampton Primary School that is named after him and encompasses like teaching spaces as well as library resource spaces for students and teachers. And I can tell you that that resource centre, the Garth Boomer Resource Centre, is alive and buzzing. And I will just add too that Littlehampton Primary School also have a Garth Boomer Award presented each year for their students, mainly focusing on their writing that is, well, actually every child, to be honest, puts together kind of like a portfolio each year of their writing, and those are submitted for the Garth Boomer Award. So it's a beautiful connection still to the amazing work, well, I'm going to say the amazing literacy energy he created. But as you enter the library, there's even a poem that he has written, which it would be nice for us to add in here, to be honest. And many of the children know that poem by heart. So it's just lovely, all these little people that know about Garth Boomer and his impact.
And have never met him. but he's still having an impact.
Yes. Yeah.
And as a young classroom teacher, I was absolutely inspired by an article, and we will make these available through the show notes, that Garth published in 1983 called In Search of a Universal Literacy Program, which completely changed or affirmed approaches to my teaching. It wasn't about a commercial program, it was about the teacher as designer and instigator of learning and responded to the needs of the learners. He gave about 10 learning principles that he distilled for use by teachers to empower their teaching. He also gave practical tips for teachers on what it wouldn't look like in a classroom. And we'll make these available as well on our show notes. I took this work into my literacy teaching, but also animation work I was doing on multimedia computers, resulting in students in my class presenting at the World Conference on Computers in Education in Sydney. The students gave examples of how Garth's principles empowered their reading, writing and animation work. He later came to see a workshop I was presenting and recommended that I share it as part of his Windows on Practice initiative he had going on in South Australian schools. But to help us find out more about Garth today, and it will really only be a snapshot and awareness raising, we are very excited to have Dr. Mike Delena, formerly Director, Learning, Language and Literacy Research Centre, University of South Australia, and the Hong Kong Institute of Education, now the University of Hong Kong. I was privileged to stumble across an amazing workshop by Mike when I was a young teacher, when he was leading learning and literacy work at Wattle Park Teacher Centre. He had a profound impact on my teaching, deeply changing and improving my practices. I didn't know it, but Mike's work was really at the cutting edge of educational practices in the world at the time. South Australia became a beacon for educators from all over Australia, indeed all over the world, for the best, most innovative literacy practices available. Welcome, Mike.
Nice to be here.
Sorry for the long introduction.
No, that's fine.
Of course, not you alone have been influenced by Mike and his work.
Yep.
That was completely transformational for me too. The graduate diploma in literacy and language.
Yes.
That was really an incredible project through the university, but for all sectors of education in South Australia.
It was fun and marvellous being part of it.
Wasn't it? It was getting together. It was such a powerful group of both lecturers and...
All the teachers that came were people who'd been recommended by the education department or Catholic education or the independent schools. And so I was privileged to be working with an elite group of people. And the idea, of course, was that I'd managed to persuade the school systems that we really needed to work with teachers in the schools and upgrade. I couldn't do it because I hadn't been in classrooms for many years. And so we brought all you young, vigorous, thoughtful people in who helped us shape the materials and practices that helped to change the schools.
Yeah.
I remember you doing a workshop on writing, Mike, and I remember it to this day, and I took those ideas immediately back into the classroom about how to get kids writing, and it was amazing. It just worked, and I couldn't believe it.
But what we're really talking about here, of course, is the power of professional learning.
I think that what you're talking about, Sharon, were the golden years of education, literacy education, certainly in South Australia and in Victoria. In New South Wales, it was very much harder because of a very solid group of people who saw that there was only one way of teaching, and that was teaching through phonics and using commercial materials. We explored something different that was so exciting for people here and in the United States, where we had an even bigger influence, was that, well, my American friends who came here were astonished that we were able to have classrooms that were alive and exciting with kids learning without the teachers depending on textbooks and materials produced by somebody else. And I think the people who came through the graduate diploma, people such as you, had an understanding and a commitment to working with children learning rather than teachers forcing things into them, and that was a very powerful time. I think South Australia became famous because of it.
And where did that come from, Mike? You know, what was the spark that allowed that to happen?
It's a good question. I think Garth Boomer was at the heart of it. He and I worked separately. He worked in the education system. I worked in what became the university, but then was the South Australia College of Advanced Education. It happened in various places around Australia. I remember Brian Campbell in New South Wales. We met actually when he came as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, and Ross Latham in Perth. And the three of us all at the same time began to realise there was a need for really dealing with literacy and dealing with it in a non-prescriptive way that had been the formula of the past. I think Garth and I were particularly influenced by the work of the London Institute, a group of people there who focused on child language development and understanding that kids learnt whatever you did. Kids were great searchers after knowledge. They were little learning machines, as Frank Smith said, and part of the job was to build an environment where people continued to learn, where they were allowed to. My primary school years, I felt, were repressive. I was stopped learning by my school. I was a little learning machine because my mum used to read to me and lovely things like that. But I think those ideas permeated Australia for a while, and they were the big years.
Yeah, so it was a time where Australia changed in certain pockets, but South Australia seemed to change even more. There seemed to be more going on here than other states. Was that the case?
I think we have to recognise the work in South Australia by Tess Corst, a woman who set up the Reading Development Centre. It was a pretty traditional approach to teaching young children to read. And it was rather phonics-based, but it also recognised the value of kids reading and learning to read by reading. Tess and I set up the first reading association in Australia, Australian Reading Association. It was the South Australian Reading Association, which then had a conference. It previously had been a branch of the International Reading Association, which was run by a professor who didn't have much contact with schools. But that began to change things, and I think then there was a feeling that people wanted to know more. I looked around and did some work in schools in literacy and was astonished to find that there were kids, particularly immigrant kids, who'd never learnt much English and hadn't learnt to read, and nobody had ever noticed. And so I got interested in what was called then, and I heard it for the first time, literacy education or reading education at first. And that's why we began the graduate diploma.
And so it was a South Australian Reading Association, but then that became the Australian Reading Association, did it? Or?
Yes, that was the first bit. Previously, they'd been little branches of the International Reading Association, but the states picked it up, and while I was away actually in America, and built up the Australian Reading Association.
Which has become the Australian Literacy Educators Association.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just for the history, mind you, I think it was still the Reading Association when we both found ourselves on that committee.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something too about the influence of writing and pick up on what you said about writing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that really made schools come alive was what we came to call the writing revolution. For me, it came from when I happened to be in America, and I was at the graduation of a woman called Glenda Bissix, who wrote a wonderful PhD about her son learning to read by writing. He wrote before he ever went to school, and he learned to read and made up his own invented spellings. And Glenda said to me, "What are you doing next, Mike?" And I said, "Well, I don't know much about writing. I want to think about writing." She said, "Well, you should go up to New Hampshire and talk to Donald Graves and Donald Murray." And so one summer I drove up from Lake George through beautiful countryside, and for 3 weeks I sat in writing conferences and writing myself and talking about writing. And I realised that he was dynamite. And so I came back to South Australia and set up a small group of people, including Mem Fox and a few others, and we experimented with our writing conferences, and it was just magic. It was a wonderful time. And it wasn't hard to translate that into working with kids, particularly as Donald Graves' graduate students, people like Susie Sowers and others, were writing about trying writing like this in their schools in, I think, New Hampshire and Vermont. And that seemed to energise. We moved away from worrying about specifics of reading to focusing on what kids could do. And so many of them learnt to read better by reading their own writing and publishing books and having a wonderful time and doing it.
Yeah, and that strong reading-writing connection.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That I think we're currently in a place where that's far more separated.
I just remember, that conference I went up to the Wattle Park Teacher Centre, and I went to the conference with you, Mike, and Mem Fox was there as well, and she was talking about read aloud, and you were talking about writing, and it was about just trying to get kids to write by, saying, who are all the people you know, what are all the events you can think about, what are all the places that you visited or you've been to, and then you had 3 columns with all those things that you could remember, and then you tried to connect those across. I just remember that being an amazing way of getting kids to, when they're stuck for what they're going to write about.
I remember talking in the University of New Hampshire with Donald Graves, and he making the point that what was vital was getting kids to have a sense of authority. And that's what author came from.
Yes.
And he said the one thing that kids are authoritative about is their own life and their own experiences. And if you can get kids to identify the things that they know about and care about, all the day-to-day things like what did you have for breakfast sort of thing, you're really getting into an incredibly powerful source of kids' motivation. They love talking about themselves as we love talking about ourselves.
I'm not sure whether this podcast is going to be about Donald Graves, Garth Boomer, or Mike Delena.
They're all connected.
Yeah, that's right.
No, Garth was very much the inspirer and the supporter of teachers. I think more than anything else, he confirmed and rationalised and supported the idea that our teaching ought to be child-centred.
Yeah.
That we can't just make up a set of facts and stuff to stuff into kids. They were willing to read and write right from the beginning, and our job was to set up the environment which could happen and provide all the support. Garth was a great supporter of Vygotsky, and me too. I love the idea that teachers were there to provide I'm trying to think of the metaphors, the training wheels, that as you have little bikes with training wheels on them, the kids have all of that support. And I found that with writing. Once I worked in a school with a boy who was barely literate. This was in America. And I took his writing, and it was salad. It didn't make any sense. It was all gibberish. He couldn't write. And I asked him to tell his story, say something. And I wrote it down for him. And I said, you write that down now. And he wrote it down. And gradually we together, me with the support, the scaffolding, helped him come up with a nice piece of writing, which we typed up and made into something important. And boy, did he take off after that. And that was at the heart of the writing revolution for me, was getting kids to be involved in literacy and loving doing it.
Because writing is the one area where it's really hard to make a commercial program to make that happen, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it has such a great effect.
Yeah.
Not only in young kids, but in adults too. I mean, I've spent my recent years working with people writing PhDs and the same ideas work.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Garth was a writer too.
Well, he was a brilliant writer.
Yes.
I think he was able to take complex ideas and not just parrot them. Garth was a genuine innovator. He said things that no one else had ever said. And he took ideas and related them to his own experience and the experience of other teachers and made it very real. I guess the problem is that this is a confession too. He and I both assumed that teachers were like ourselves and knowledgeable and enthusiastic and wanting to make huge difference. And not all teachers have time for that. Teachers, like kids, need scaffolding too. I guess that's what our work in the graduate diploma and in the literacy and learning in the middle years project was about, helping teachers to know what and know how to help kids. And I think that seems to have disappeared a bit these days.
Well, someone was saying they think we had a lot more resources back then, where we had a lot more funding for personnel to allow that professional development to go further out into all the schools. And that has been probably cut back in recent years, and hence the reliance on programs, because then, you just give the program out for the teachers to follow. But we had, back in those days, we had a lot more professional development going on. The curriculum department of the education department was quite large. Now it's not as big as that. Would that be part of it, do you think?
I think it's absolutely critical part of it. I look back and think how lucky I was in the International Year of Literacy. Whitlam was in power and had set up the innovations, set up the Schools Commission, which Garth became chairman of, and the innovations program, which, let me tell you a story about this. This may be irrelevant, but
I love a story.
I had a phone call from a guy, and he said he wanted to talk to me. He was from Canberra, but he couldn't get to me because his leg was in plaster. Would I meet him? And he was going to the airport. Would I meet him and talk to him on a bus? And I couldn't work out why this guy was calling me. He must have heard from Interstate that we'd done some things here. But he told me, he said, look, I've got $6 million to spend. How do you think I should spend it? I was absolutely staggered. Of course, I had no way of answering this. It turned out that he was chairman of the Innovations Program, which developed then, and 3 people from South Australia, one from the Education Department, one from the university, and me, were invited to go to Canberra, and we helped set up the guidelines for this program. And basically it said to schools, look, if you're prepared to focus your work on something new and something valuable for kids, as long as you look after Aboriginal kids, women, girls, immigrants and others, people who've disadvantaged, we'll consider it. So then a group in South Australia from across the school systems, head of primary school of Catholic education, a few others, when people applied, put in applications to do things like small Catholic schools say, we want an after-school program for all the kids who have nowhere to go and we don't have any books for them to read. So do you think I could get some money for books? And so we said, yeah. And the extreme end was somebody from a technical high school said, look, I'm teaching woodwork and we'd like to build a boat. I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, how many girls do woodwork? He said, none. I said, well, look, I think your chances of getting a grant are Buckley's. But if you rewrote your program and included the girls, it might be considered more favourably. And they went ahead, they got it, they built their boat.
With the girls.
So it was a time when all things were possible. But coming back to your point, Phil, about the support for teachers, apart from that, which only affected a small group of people, but was very powerful, I think it wasn't just a matter of money. When we set up the Literacy and Learning in the Middle Years program, I managed to persuade Garth Boomer to release Phil Cormack and Helen Campagna Wildash to the project. I managed to persuade the head of Catholic education to give me Kevin Comer and Deirdre Travers, and Barbara Comer and I simply went ahead and ran this graduate diploma, which was, we were the core group, And then we worked originally with 30 carefully selected teachers by the education department 1 year, and then another 30, and then another 30. And all these people did everything virtually for free, except the education department gave the project, those people, and Catholic education. Now, the only money spent after that was that I managed to persuade people, and that time there was enough money around, to have those teachers, the limey tutors as we call them, the people who are graduates of this program, work in their own school half-time with another half-time teacher working with them, and they then would teach programs voluntarily after school to other teachers who came voluntarily. So once the universities and the school systems got together and worked this out, it is possible to run teacher development programs which aren't really very expensive.
That's incredible. And to me, this was something that wasn't happening in other places in the world.
I don't think it ever did. My American university classmate referred to this as we were turnkey trainers, that we were training people to turn keys, to open the locks, to let things happen. He incidentally... the reason we got to America, the program went to America, was that we did a pre-conference research institute in Las Vegas where all of us, the key developers, went there and presented this teacher development program in Australia. At first we started with a handful of people, but then the word went around, the Australians are here. And I think we had 200 people crammed into this place and people hanging through windows and doors. And it was eventually sold to the United States and through Rigby, which Rigby Australia became Rigby America too. So the people who, by the way, who spent money like Education Department, Catholic Education and the university all got money back from when it was sold in America. So it was perhaps didn't cost anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. And yet we think professional development is going to be more expensive than programs, but maybe we need to think again in today's world. But there's something about people working with people rather than people working with textbooks, isn't there? I don't think we ever taught textbooks in the whole of the literacy and learning in the middle years program.
No.
We were working with experienced teachers who had a lot of know-how. They didn't necessarily have a background in understanding language, understanding child development, understanding children's literature and those things. And they were the basis, really, of the teachers developing the appropriate understanding for helping children learn to read and write. And as you said, you don't need textbooks to learn to write. No. Although I'm sure the Americans will have already produced these, because when I worked as a consultant in a black school in Boston 1 year, I was given the job of raising the reading scores of all the kids. And I said to my boss, who was a very experienced civil rights black woman who was a Harvard graduate student, I said to her, look, I think I can raise the reading scores very easily. It'll only take me a week or two. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'll teach the kids to take tests. Because I'd realised the kids had no idea of passing a reading test. And you could lift the scores like that. And she said, no, Mike, I don't want that. I want them to really learn to read. So that was that.
Concentrated on that. So, Mark, let's just concentrate on Garth Boomer for a minute. Can you describe your professional relationship with Garth? In what capacities you worked together?
With Garth?
Yeah.
In actual fact, our careers, we never... The only times we actually worked together was once I went to a conference at Raywood in the early days when secondary schools had wiped out the intermediate and leaving exams, and teachers were shocked and horrified. What will I do? And I'll tell you another anecdote, which you may not use. I was teaching at Murray Bridge High School, and the commercial teacher, Gordon, was crying. I said, what's wrong, Gordon? He said, they've cut out the intermediate exam. What will I do now? I said, Gordon, you've taught girls wonderful shorthand, typing and bookkeeping, and you're going to continue. They'll all get good results as they've always had. And he sort of breathed whatever it is.
Cyber relief.
Yes.
Yeah.
Garth and I were among a group all working on a new curriculum for English, and I was there because I was excited about film study, and I was getting kids into film at Murray High, and Garth was doing something else, I think Mount Barker or somewhere there, and I was really inspired by this young guy. He was hotshot, and he was smart, and he was inspiring. And I kept seeing him at conferences and reading his stuff, and then both of us applied for director of Wattle Park Teacher Centre, and quite properly, Garth got the job because he was the guy, and I think he had a superb influence there. He really got people, changed their lives, and I wish we could have another teaching centre of that kind.
Yes, I was just going to say maybe it's worth thinking about some of those things that the Teachers Centre brought to teachers, one of them being Garth's Windows on Classroom Practice series. Like that was a publication that came out, I don't know how frequently. We seem to have a lot of them still in our collection.
I think it was a dissemination hub for ideas about good practice and knowledge about teaching that you never got from university. No. I want to go back to that at some stage and talk about the fact that we need to do better in teacher training pre-service as well as in service.
Yes, but that teaching centre, it would be great to bring something like that back.
Well, one of the problems today is the internet, where there is so many things and they don't know what to choose from, really. Back then it was more, we were just hungry for ideas, and the Wattle Park Teacher Centre provided that, didn't they? But now teachers don't know where to turn. There's so much to choose from.
Well, I think the strength of the Teachers Centre was that the materials that came from there were created by teachers.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big point of differentiation for some of the materials that teachers now access. And that you could also get, like I remember even being in an independent school, we could access resources from the Teachers Centre. It was available to all teachers, not just department teachers, and even for people to come and work with you in the classroom.
Yeah.
So those sorts of teacher supports.
I think what you're talking about is an ideological change. At that time, we believed in the professionalism of teachers, that at the heart of it was a knowledgeable, committed and caring teacher. Nothing else mattered. It wasn't the materials. And there's a fairly strong evidential base for this belief. I'll come back to that in a while. The professionalism came home to me in America when I was standing at the doorway of Roxbury High School, which was a black school in Boston, and I was talking to the headmaster, who was a wonderful guy. And the conversation came up that I wanted to have after-school work with the teachers. And it turned out they couldn't come after school because their contract meant that they had to be paid extra if they stayed after school. I was horrified, and I talked to the principal about this. And when I told him that the Director of Education in South Australia was a former teacher, a recent teacher, and that everybody in the administration were teachers, and that the education was run by teachers, not by bureaucrats and not by distant professors or whatever.
And we'll take a break there from part 1 of our podcast. We look forward to you joining us for part 2. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.